I happen to really love this story about Thomas. I think Thomas, for me, gives me permission to doubt and to question, and I think probably my faith is deeper because of it. So I want to just give you just a little context to John's gospel. John is telling a story here that John's writing this 60 years after the resurrection. We're thinking about, well, we just had Easter last Sunday. 60 years later, John's writing this as a gospel writer, and it's pretty clear that Thomas, he wasn't there when everyone else was seeing this resurrected Jesus, so he wanted proof. And what I love about Thomas is he just names it. He's honest. He's not mincing any words. You need to show me, Lord. And I really love that authenticity about him. And so as John describes, this is also what I love about the story, Jesus shows the wounds. And to me, there's something about the woundedness of Jesus, now resurrected, that means so much. And I guess what it means to me is you don't get through the transitions and the transformations of life without wounds and without pain. And that makes it all the more authentic story. But why this story is so important to John's listener, and to you and me, I think, is 60 years later, they've never met Jesus. They're hearing stories about him. And in this story, Jesus says to Thomas, it's wonderful that you believe, brother, but thanks be to God, really, for all those who believe without seeing. Kind of reminds me of Mr. Rogers. God bless his soul. I actually didn't grow up. Who watched Mr. Rogers growing up? Did you? Some of you did? My wife, she's like watching it the other day going like, there's a documentary on Mr. Rogers, and she just grew up with him and just thinks he's the greatest, and he really is a very special soul. One of the things I always remember him saying, though, and he looked out to the political powers of his time, and he said it in simple words. What is important to the lives of the children of today is invisible. What's really important is invisible and hard to see. And he was making a very clear point that they just didn't quite get it. And there's something to say about that about faith. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe, Jesus says. I was with a friend this week, and it was his first Easter since his wife Mary has died. And so my friend says he went to the big Easter service as he's done for all his years, and he's a retired soul. And he said, Easter, all that fanfare is wonderful. And he said, then I went home, and I realized I felt as empty as that empty tomb. I just felt empty. Like Easter was not Easter. Like this is the first time in, over 40 years that he was without his wife. And the authenticity of his questioning and his doubt and his pain, although it's hard to be there as someone describes their loneliness and their sadness, there's something incredibly real about that anyone here who is a human being at one time or another are going to face a grief like that at some level. And I'm talking to lots of people as I do every week, and we have a synagogue shooting in California. We have Sri Lanka. The church is bombed. We have, of course, New Zealand, the mosque. And everywhere I go, when people find out I'm a minister, there's just this overwhelming sense of really quite a lot of despair. What is this world coming to? Religious people going to worship as we do freely. They can't even worship without somebody wanting to kill them. Somebody said to me as well, if you even look at the political climate of this day, it was big news this week. Prince Edward Island, the politicians actually hugged each other, the loser and the winner. And everyone goes, they had to be in the Maritimes because they know how to care for people. And they just said, the loser actually was hugging the guy that beat him, and they were actually being respectful of each other. We need more of that in all politics in all the world. It can get very discouraging at times, and I think what this story today really says to me, and you have to discern for your own self, Like, I really think it's important to be honest with your doubt. I think there's more honesty and faith in our doubt and our questions than could ever be. I want to close with a story about a woman who's written a book, and this is a pretty profound story by Barbara Newhall. She wrote, it's called Wrestling with God. She says that she grew up feeling that Jesus was very real. She had experienced a mystical encounter with Jesus when she was 12. Jesus was real, and God, of course. But one day, she grew very tired of just the way faith was and the church, and saw an interview recently of the people who are questioning the faith. I mean, they might have been fundamentalists at one time, thought everything in the Bible was literally true. Now they question everything. And she goes into this mode where she was actually pregnant, and she couldn't feel her baby moving inside. So she rushed off to the doctors, and she said to herself, I'm not a believer anymore. And she said, there's no way I'm going to beg God for help right now, because if I beg God to help my unborn child, how am I going to accept a cruel God if my child dies? So that's how she went from God is everything to no God, and there was no in between. She gets there, and sure enough, the child is okay, and she has this wonderful blessing of a birth of a child. But even at the birth of a child, she still can't say thanks to God, because if I thank God, what happens if something happens to this child? So she just had a really bad taste left in her mouth about God and the phoniness of churches that were all about money, or the fundamentalists that judge gay people, or, the list goes on, where people really get let down by faith, by God, by the church. However, something happened as she grew. She started showing up in church occasionally, and she said as she wrote her book, I'd show up in a church and I would just maybe look for some hope that there might be a God. She goes, I just thought I'd try it. And she goes, most of the time God didn't show up. So church life wasn't working too well. But every once in a while she'd have a fleeting glimpse of God. Something was nudging at her. Kept nudging, and for some reason she couldn't stop but thinking that maybe this uncertainty, maybe this doubt, and all this questioning, there was a purpose to it. Then she says she remembered that even Peter, who failed to trust Jesus on the water of Sea of Galilee, he dropped out of fear. Maybe there was a path that she was on that, So she decided to start a little project. And her little project was she was going to interview people. Does God exist? Where's God in this tragedy? Can I feel God or not? Does God really care? And she discovered in this interview process, she interviewed people from all walks of faith, not just Christians. She met Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists. And she did this for 15 years. 1997, she finished her last interview was a Hindu guru. And again, she asked the questions, do you believe in God? Can you trust God? These were her questions. And suddenly she said, after all these interviews, she says, I was struck by how God began to show up. And to my shocking surprise, it didn't come in a lightning bolt. She said, I heard the stories of people's lives. Their resilient spirit, they suffered greatly. They had tragedies beyond belief. But something, even in the wrestling, something kept showing up. And she said at the end of all her interviews, what was abundantly clear is that life, as mysterious as it is and painful as it is still a miracle. I would say it's a gift. She says it's a miracle that you wake up and you're alive and you're breathing. It's a miracle that you can wrestle with God and you can just be hugely honest with God about anything. I think that's what Thomas gives to us today. Don't be afraid to wrestle and ask those deepest questions. So my friend who was feeling so lonely and empty after Easter, after sharing it with some friends It wasn't a case of suddenly we're going to take our friend out and make him happy. I think it was just a case of him being able to share that sometimes we feel very absent from God. And the life that we once had is not the life we have anymore. And you start realizing that even maybe the faith you had as a child, or the faith that you had last week, or the faith that you thought your parents had given you, suddenly it becomes yours. And that's, I think, the journey that I've been on recently, because I can get very down and discouraged, and sometimes the only way I can deal with the news is to turn the darn thing off until somebody comes along and says, "Did you read this today?" As I do like the news. But I want to end with this. If you really do look at the news closely, or you look at any situation or any life situation, if you look really deeply and you plunge into the wounds that the risen Christ offers, you're going to discover that in, I believe, almost every situation, that God might be hidden, but God is secretly working there and is invisible and is making miraculous things happen over and over again. Maybe it's those politicians out in PEI that hugged each other. Or maybe it's the person that came up to you and just said, "Can I offer a prayer for you?" And those prayers and that care means the world.